Hello again, gang. One of the works that we read for this week was a selection from the novel Dracula. I thought it would be a good idea to take a look at what literary critics say about vampire literature in general before we discuss Dracula in particular. Our sources for this presentation are Devendra P. Varma, Clive Leatherdale, Margaret L. Carter, and Gina Whisker. Let's begin by taking a very brief look at the history of the vampire in literature. According to literary critic Devendra P. Varma, images of vampire-like beings date back to ancient Asian religions. Vampire fangs first appeared on images of the Nepal Lord of Death, the Tibetan Devil, and the Mongolian God of Time. Varma tells us that stories of some of these gods indicated they survived by drinking blood. In addition, we know that both ancient Egyptians and Chinese believed in vampires. Tales of vampires eventually evolved into folklore, which spread first throughout Eastern Europe and then into Western Europe, according to literary critic Clive Leatherdale. But the vampire we know and love is based on the vampires of literature, not folklore. The German poets were the first writers who recognized the potential of a vampire for literary work, and vampires appeared in German poetry in the 1700s, Leatherdale says. This German poetry was translated into English, so the Britons were familiar with the term vampire as early as 1730. Vampires and vampire-like creatures appealed to the British Romantic poets writing in the late 1700s, and they appeared in the works of poets such as Coleridge, Shelley, Byron, and Keats. But the first vampire novel, and the first vampire prose in English, was The Vampire, spelled with a Y, written by John William Polidori, who was Byron's friend and personal physician, that is, his drug supplier. The short novel, published in 1819, differed from folklore that often featured vampires, who were simple, rustic peasants who confined their killing to family members and neighbors in an isolated setting. Polidori's vampire was Lord Ruthven, a member of an aristocratic family, and he preyed on victims from an expanded geographic area. The regal, aristocratic nature of vampires, including Count Dracula, Lestat and Anne Rice's novels, and Barnabas Collins in Dark Shadows, reflect the young aristocratic vampire first seen in Polidori's work. Now, Polidori's The Vampire is a short novella, but it was followed in 1847 by Varney the Vampire, spelled with an I this time. That novel is over 800 pages long and was written by either Thomas Prescott Prest or James Malkin Rymer, according to literary critic Margaret L. Carter. The other vampire tale in English that preceded Dracula was J. Sheridan Le Fanu's short story Carmilla, which is a story of a lesbian vampire narrated by Laura, one of her long-term victims and lovers. But the most famous and enduring early vampire prose in English is the novel Dracula that was written in 1897 by Bram Stoker. In many ways, Stoker's Dracula serves as a blueprint for the literary and cinematic vampires from the late 18th through the 21st centuries. But many modern vampire tales are love stories, and there was no love story in Stoker's work. In fact, some modern works have converted the vampire from a creature of horror and revulsion into such a romantic figure that some vampire stories are little more than what one literary critic terms teenage sex with fangs. Now, in literature, the vampire is usually a metaphor for the loss or ineffectiveness of social controls, according to literary critic Gina Whisker. Usually those controls are re-established at the end of the work by the death of the vampire. While the vampire work can represent the loss of control in any area, It tends to encode the fears of sexuality, literally walking the streets and stalking the innocent, Whisker says. The vampire tale also expresses the taboos of eroticism and relates that the place of sexuality in the social order is within marriage. But because it is outside of marriage, the sexuality represented in vampire tales cannot be accessed in the traditional way, but instead seeks new doors to enter. Always invited, Whisker says. Now, Whisker points out that marriage particularly places limits on female sexuality. It has traditionally been more accepted and even expected for husbands to have affairs. But female sexuality outside of marriage has generally been disdained by Western culture. As a result, female vampires are usually seen as particularly taboo and horrific, Whisker says. She goes on to say that until very recently, marriage has restricted sexuality to heterosexuality, and many vampire stories are homoerotic. Whisker states that vampire literature relates the horror of sexual promiscuity and its effect on society by recreating an atmosphere of dread and disgust that leads to punishment and even death. Now, while some critics focus on the transgression of the homoeroticism in vampire tales, Whisker maintains that it is actually the all-inclusive sexuality of the vampire that transgresses. Vampires will strike members of the opposite sex, the same sex, and even children, Whisker points out. I think that provides us with some background on vampires and helps enhance our enjoyment of vampire literature and movies. If you have any questions or you need clarification of anything, you know all you have to do is drop me an email through Canvas. I'm always happy to hear from you. Thanks a lot for paying attention to this presentation. Have a good day.